My name is Anya Warren. Until 72 hours ago, I was the senior deployment engineer at Wildfire Technologies, which is a fancy way of saying I was the person who made sure our software updates didn't accidentally destroy our clients' businesses. Past tense matters here. Let me paint you a picture of what that job actually meant. Wildfire runs infrastructure for mid-sized financial services companies, the kind of firms that process millions of transactions daily but can't afford the massive IT departments that banks have. When we push code to production, we're touching systems that handle actual money moving between actual accounts. One bad deployment, one corrupted database migration, one misconfigured load balancer, and suddenly a few thousand people can't access their retirement funds. Or worse, they can access funds that aren't theirs. I'd been doing this for 6 years. 6 years of 3 a.m. rollbacks, 6 years of reading deployment logs like some people read mystery novels, 6 years of being the person who says, "No, we're not pushing this on a Friday afternoon," while everyone else groans. You don't get thanked for the disasters that never happen. You get a reputation for being cautious, timid, risk-averse. Stella Hartfield, our CTO, a woman who'd spent exactly 18 months in an actual technical role before ascending into management, had a different philosophy. Stella believed in velocity. In moving fast and breaking things, except we weren't a scrappy startup anymore. We were responsible for systems where breaking things meant regulatory fines and class action lawsuits. The meeting happened on a Tuesday. I remember because Tuesdays were our deployment review days, which Stella had started calling deployment drag meetings, behind my back. Not quietly enough behind my back, as it turned out. She called me into her office at 4 p.m. The setting sun was turning her glass-walled space into a greenhouse, and she didn't seem to notice or care that I was squinting against the glare. "Anya, I want to talk about the deployment process." I'd heard this opening before. I settled into the chair across from her minimalist desk. "Sure. What aspect?" "All of it." She leaned forward, fingers steepled. "We're falling behind our competitors in feature velocity. Our release cycle is too conservative." "Our release cycle," I said carefully, "is designed around our clients' risk tolerance. Most of them explicitly require." "I'm aware of the contracts." She waved a hand. "But we're interpreting them in the most restrictive way possible. Other companies in our space are shipping weekly. We're shipping monthly. Other companies in our space have also had outages that made the trade's publications. I can send you the articles." The smile she gave me was the kind you'd give a child who'd said something adorably naive. That's exactly the mindset I'm talking about. We need someone who's willing to be bolder. Who understands that some calculated risk is part of innovation. My stomach went cold. "You're replacing me." "I'm reassigning the deployment lead role to Colin Briggs. You'll move to a senior advisory position. We still value your institutional knowledge, obviously. But Colin has a different energy. He's hungry. He's willing to push boundaries." Colin Briggs. 28 years old. Smart enough, technically. The kind of engineer who'd spent the last year lobbying for us to adopt every new framework and tool that hit Hacker News, regardless of whether it actually solved problems we had. He'd once suggested we rewrite our entire deployment pipeline in a language that had been released 6 months earlier because it had better async primitives. When I'd asked him to define what problems our current async handling was causing, he'd looked at me like I'd asked him to explain why water is wet. "When does this transition happen?" I asked. "Immediately. Colin's already been briefed. He'll be leading Friday's deployment." Friday. 3 days away. We had a major release scheduled, a database schema migration that touched every table in our transaction processing system. I'd been planning it for 6 weeks, coordinating with our infrastructure team, our database administrators, our client success team who'd warned affected customers. It was the kind of deployment where you measure your rollback procedures in minutes, not hours, because every minute of downtime cost clients real money. "Stella, Friday's deployment is complex. Colin hasn't been involved in the planning. Maybe we should." "Anya." Her voice sharpened. "This is exactly what I'm talking about. You're already catastrophizing. Colin is more than capable. He's actually excited about this. That's the kind of attitude we need." I could have argued. I could have escalated to the CEO, laid out exactly why this was a terrible decision. But here's something I've learned about corporate dynamics: once a CTO has made a decision that validates their worldview, contradicting them just makes you look petty and territorial. The decision was made. My choices were to accept it with grace or to accept it while looking like a bitter has-been. Understood, I said. I'll make sure Colin has all my documentation. The smile returned. I knew you'd be professional about this. This is actually an opportunity for you to mentor the next generation. I spent Tuesday evening putting together a transition document. Not a bitter, passive-aggressive one full of landmines, a real one. 40 pages covering every deployment I'd managed, every near-miss I'd caught, every quirk of our production environment. The specific order in which our microservices needed to restart to avoid cascade failures. The database indexes that needed rebuilding after certain types of schema changes. The monitoring thresholds that looked like errors but were actually normal behavior during deployments. I sent it to Colin at 11 p.m. He responded at 11:07, thanks. Looks comprehensive. Ready to crush this flexed biceps. Wednesday, I met with Colin to walk him through Friday's deployment plan. We sat in a conference room that smelled like old coffee and dry erase markers. I pulled up my deployment runbook, a minute-by-minute timeline covering 6 hours of coordinated work. So we start the deployment at 11 p.m. Friday, I began. That gives us a 7-hour window before Saturday morning trading opens for our East Coast financial clients. First step is... Actually, Colin interrupted, I've been thinking we should move this to a daytime deployment. I blinked. Daytime. Yeah. The overnight thing is old-school ops thinking. If our systems are properly architected, we should be able to deploy without downtime. It's less disruptive to the team. Colin, this deployment requires taking the transaction processing system offline. There's no way to do a live migration of this particular schema change. It's not about architecture, it's about... I talked to Stella about it. She agrees that we've been too dependent on maintenance windows. She wants us to prove we can do zero downtime deployments. I felt something very calm and very cold settle into my chest. This specific deployment cannot be zero downtime. The migration scripts require exclusive locks on tables that handle active transactions. You run this during business hours, you freeze every client's transaction processing. Colin leaned back, arms crossed. Or we find a better way to do it. I've been looking at some blue-green deployment strategies, which we don't have the infrastructure for, which would take months to implement properly. Colin, I'm not trying to gatekeep here. I'm telling you that the work to enable what you're describing hasn't been done. Friday's deployment uses the infrastructure we have, which requires a maintenance window. Anya. His voice took on a patronizing edge. I appreciate your experience. But part of what Stella wants is fresh thinking. Not just doing things the way they've always been done. I looked at him for a long moment. He met my eyes with the confidence of someone who'd never had a production system die under his hands, never had to call a client at 3 a.m. to explain why their business was offline, never had to write a post-mortem that began with root cause, inadequate planning. Okay, I said. What time are you planning to start? I'm thinking 2 p.m. Most clients are past their morning rush, not yet into end-of-day processing. And the rollback plan? If something goes wrong, we'll roll back. Should take like 15 minutes. The actual rollback, if we got into a corrupted state mid-migration, would take 4 to 6 hours. I'd timed it. I had 3 different rollback procedures documented depending on exactly where in the process things failed. But I didn't say that. Make sure you document your approach, I said instead. For the post-mortem file. He grinned. Always so pessimistic. This is going to go fine. Wednesday night, I did something I probably shouldn't have. I set up a remote monitoring dashboard on my personal laptop, nothing I didn't have legitimate access to, just consolidated all the production metrics I normally watched during deployments into a single view. CPU usage across our application cluster. Database connection pools. Transaction processing queues. Error rates. Network throughput. I told myself it was just professional interest. I'd built these systems. I wanted to see how Colin's approach worked out. Maybe I'd learn something. Maybe fresh eyes really would find a better way. I absolutely did not believe that. But I wanted the dashboard anyway. Thursday, Colin sent out an announcement email. Exciting news, team. We're moving tomorrow's deployment to 2 p.m. and implementing a new zero downtime strategy. This represents a major evolution in our deployment maturity. Brief service interruption possible but should be minimal. Our head of infrastructure, Catherine Yates, responded within 5 minutes, Colin, I don't see any infrastructure changes in the deployment plan. What zero downtime mechanism are we using? Colin's response, we'll leverage the existing connection pooling and load balancing. The key is confidence and quick execution. I watched that email thread from my desk, hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had gone cold. Catherine tried twice more to get specifics. Colin's responses got vaguer and more jargon-heavy. Eventually she stopped asking. Not because he'd convinced her, because she'd realized the decision was above her pay grade. At 4 p.m. Thursday, Stella sent a company-wide email praising Colin's innovative approach to deployment strategy and positioning Friday's release as a demonstration of Wildfire's commitment to operational excellence and rapid iteration. I forwarded my 40-page transition document to my personal email. Then I forwarded every deployment runbook I'd ever written. Then I went home and tried to sleep and failed. Friday morning felt surreal. I came into the office knowing I had no official role in what was about to happen. My calendar had been cleared. I was, as Stella had framed it, available for advisory support if Colin needed it. Colin spent the morning in a conference room with his deployment team, 3 engineers who normally handled feature development, none of whom had ever led a production deployment before. I walked past at 11 a.m. and heard laughter. Someone said something about finally moving fast. I got lunch alone at a sandwich shop 2 blocks away. The woman behind the counter made small talk about the weather. I agreed that yes, it was unseasonably warm. I did not say that in approximately 3 hours, several $1 million of financial transactions were going to start queuing up in a system that was about to have its database yanked out from under it. At 1:45 p.m., I was back at my desk. My official desktop showed my email and some documentation I was supposedly reviewing. My personal laptop, angled away from the door, showed my monitoring dashboard. At 1:58 p.m., I watched the deployment start. A sudden spike in database connection attempts as Colin's team began running migration scripts. Transaction processing queue depth starting to climb, not crashing, just backing up, like water behind a dam. At 2:03 p.m., the first alerts fired. Database connection pool exhausted. Clients were attempting to process transactions, but the database was locked for migration, so those attempts were hanging, consuming connections, waiting for locks that wouldn't release until the migration finished. At 2:07 p.m., I watched our primary application cluster start to struggle. CPU usage spiking not from actual work but from threads waiting on database locks, consuming memory, waiting. At 2:12 p.m., the first timeout errors appeared in the application logs. Clients attempting transactions, waiting the full 30-second timeout period, then receiving errors. From their perspective, our system was just frozen. My phone rang. Catherine Yates. Anya, are you seeing this? I'm seeing it. Colin's team is in the war room. They're saying everything is fine, the migration is proceeding normally. But our error rates are spiking. Client transactions are failing. The migration is proceeding, I said. That's technically true. It's just also true that while it's proceeding, nothing else can use the database. How long until the migration finishes? I checked the migration script's progress logs. At current rate? 45 minutes. Maybe longer if the locks start causing performance degradation. Anya, we're going to have clients calling. We need to. I don't have deployment authority anymore, Catherine. That's Colin's call. A pause. Right. Yes. Okay. She hung up. At 2:19 p.m., our client success team started forwarding emails. The messages had a similar pattern, we're experiencing system errors. All transaction processing appears to be down. What's happening? At 2:24 p.m., the first call came in from Riverside Financial, one of our largest clients. Their compliance officer, a man named Douglas Pemberton who I'd spoken with dozens of times during planned maintenance, was using his very polite, very angry voice. Anya, we're showing complete transaction processing failure. This isn't a scheduled maintenance window. What's going on? There's an unscheduled deployment happening, I said. I'm not leading it, but I'm aware of the situation. Unscheduled? We have contractual requirements about maintenance notification. I'm aware. You'll need to speak with our executive team about that. I could hear him breathing, the pause of someone reassessing the political situation. Is there an estimated resolution time? I don't have an official estimate. Unofficially? At least 30 more minutes, possibly longer. 30 minutes. Anya, we're losing real transactions. Every minute of this costs us money. I know, Douglas. I'm sorry. I'm not in a position to change what's happening. He hung up without saying goodbye. I didn't blame him. At 2:31 p.m., I got a Slack message from Colin. Hey, seeing some elevated error rates during the deployment. Is this expected? I stared at that message for a long time. I could respond in several ways. I could explain that yes, this was entirely expected given his approach, and that the error rates would continue until the migration completed. I could point him to the specific section of my transition document that outlined why daytime deployments of this type caused exactly this pattern of failures. I could offer to conference in and help manage the situation. Instead, I typed, error rates during database migrations can vary based on approach. Check your migration script progress logs. At 2:38 p.m., my monitoring dashboard showed something new. The database migration had stalled. Not failed, stalled. The progress logs showed the same table being processed over and over, likely hitting some kind of lock contention or deadlock condition that the migration scripts weren't equipped to handle. At 2:41 p.m., Stella burst into the engineering floor. I heard her before I saw her, her voice carrying across the open floor plan. Why did production go dark? The war room was glass-walled. I watched her storm in. Colin stood up, hands raised in a placating gesture. I couldn't hear the conversation, but I could see his expression, confusion transitioning to defensiveness. At 2:47 p.m., Catherine came to my desk. Anya, Stella wants you in the war room. I closed my personal laptop. Sure. The war room smelled like stress sweat and energy drinks. 6 engineers clustered around a conference table covered in laptops. Colin at the head, Stella standing behind him, arms crossed. Every screen showed red, error dashboards, alert queues, client escalation tickets. Anya. Stella's voice was tight. Colin says the deployment is proceeding normally, but we're getting reports of a complete production outage. I looked at the main display, the migration progress logs frozen on the same table for the last 9 minutes. The deployment has encountered a lock contention issue. The migration scripts are stalled. What does that mean? Stella demanded. It means the database migration is stuck trying to modify a table that something else is also trying to access. The migration can't proceed until that clears, but the thing trying to access it is waiting for the migration to finish. Deadlock. Colin jumped in. We can just restart the migration. No. I kept my voice level. Restarting would require rolling back the partially completed migration first, which in the current locked state could corrupt data. We need to first release the locks, then decide whether to roll back or continue. Stella turned to Colin. Why wasn't this in the deployment plan? The plan was for zero downtime. This is clearly not zero downtime. Her voice rose. Why are we getting client escalations about a production outage? Colin's face flushed. The architecture should have supported. Anya. Stella cut him off. Can you fix this? Here was my moment. The moment where I could graciously step in, take control, execute the rollback procedures I documented and tested. The hero returning to save the day, proving my value, maybe even getting my old rollback. I thought about 40 pages of documentation that had been acknowledged with an emoji. I thought about always so pessimistic. I thought about 6 years of being the person who prevented disasters being framed as timidity. I can, I said. But I'm not currently authorized to modify production deployments. Colin is the deployment lead. Stella's eyes narrowed. This isn't the time for politics. It's not politics. It's chain of command. Colin reports to you. You authorized this deployment approach. I'm happy to advise, but executing changes requires Colin's approval or yours. The silence stretched. Colin looked like he wanted to disappear into his chair. Stella's jaw worked. Finally, fine. You're authorized. Fix it. I'll need administrative access restored. And I need everyone who's currently logged into production to log out. Too many cooks will make this worse. Stella nodded sharply. Everyone out. Colin, restore Anya's access. The room cleared. Colin fumbled through the access restoration, avoiding my eyes. Then he left too. Just me and Stella. How long will this take? She asked. To roll back safely? 2 hours minimum. To get production stable again after that? Another hour. To migrate the client's queue transactions once we're stable? Depends on how many backed up, but probably 4 to 5 hours total. It's 2:50 p.m. on a Friday. Yes. This is going to make the trade's publications. Probably. She said something under her breath that might have been a curse. What do you need from me? Client communications. They need to hear from executive leadership that we're aware of the issue and working to resolve it. I need you to buy me time and manage expectations. Fine. Get it done. She left. I sat alone in the war room, surrounded by screens full of red alerts and error messages. I pulled up the first rollback procedure. Before I started, I sent one message to Catherine, beginning rollback. ETA to stable state, 2 hours. Please coordinate with client success on communications. Then I disconnected my personal laptop from its monitoring role and got to work with the official systems. The rollback was exactly as complex as I'd known it would be. First, releasing the database locks without corrupting the partial migration. Then, carefully reversing each schema change in the opposite order they'd been applied. Then, rebuilding the indexes that had been dropped. Then, validating data integrity across every affected table. At 3:30 p.m., I had the database back to its pre-migration state. At 4:15 p.m., I had the application cluster restarted and stable. At 4:45 p.m., I began processing the backlog of queued transactions. At 7:20 p.m., we were fully operational again. 4.5 hours of production impact. During business hours. For our financial services clients. I wrote a preliminary incident report. Root cause: deployment executed during production hours without appropriate zero downtime infrastructure in place. Contributing factors: inadequate deployment planning, insufficient rollback preparation, architecture not designed for live schema migrations. I sent it to Stella at 7:35 p.m. and went home. Saturday morning, I woke to 17 missed calls and 43 emails. The trade's publications had indeed picked up the story. Wildfire technology suffers major outage, financial clients affected. Stella's email, sent at 6:47 a.m., emergency meeting Monday 8 a.m. Mandatory attendance. Colin's email, sent at 11:23 p.m. Friday, I take full responsibility for today's issues. I should have followed Anya's documented procedures. Catherine's email, sent at 9:15 p.m. Friday, thank you for getting us stable. Client escalations are still coming in, but at least we have the system back. And one from an address I didn't recognize at first, Douglas Pemberton from Riverside Financial. Subject: formal complaint and contract review request. I read his email twice. Formal notification that Riverside was invoking the contract clause requiring review after significant service disruptions. They were demanding a meeting with Wildfire's executive team, documentation of how the outage occurred, and assurances about process improvements. 3 other clients had sent similar emails. Monday morning, I arrived at 7:45 a.m. The executive conference room was already occupied. Stella, our CEO Leonard Ashby, our general counsel Isaac Brenner, Catherine, Colin, and 2 people I didn't recognize but whose suits suggested they were from our board or our investors. I took a seat. Nobody made eye contact with me except Leonard, who nodded with an expression I couldn't read. At exactly 8 a.m., Leonard started the meeting. Let's be clear about the situation. Friday's outage resulted in approximately $2.3 million in failed transactions across our client base. 4 clients have invoked contract review clauses. 2 are threatening litigation. This is the worst production incident in company history. He looked at Stella. Walk me through how this happened. Stella's voice was controlled, but I could hear the strain. We initiated a deployment process change designed to reduce our dependence on maintenance windows. The new process encountered unforeseen complications. Unforeseen by whom? This from one of the suits, a woman with steel gray hair and a voice that could cut glass. Silence. I have here, the woman continued, pulling out a tablet, an incident report written by Anya Warren. It states, and I quote, deployment executed during production hours without appropriate zero downtime infrastructure in place. That doesn't sound unforeseen. That sounds like doing something we weren't equipped to do. Leonard turned to me. Anya, you wrote this report? Yes. In your assessment, was Friday's deployment approach viable? Every eye in the room on me. Colin's pleading. Stella's warning. No, I said. The infrastructure required for zero downtime deployments of this type doesn't exist in our environment. I documented this in transition materials provided to Colin, and raised concerns before the deployment. The decision to proceed was made above my level. What transition materials? Leonard asked. I pulled out my laptop, brought up my sent email folder, and projected it on the conference room screen. The 40-page document, sent Tuesday night. The deployment runbook review meeting notes from Wednesday. The email exchange with Catherine about infrastructure requirements. Leonard read in silence. The gray-haired woman leaned forward to read over his shoulder. Stella, Leonard said quietly, did you review these materials before authorizing the deployment? Colin assured me he was prepared. That's not what I asked. Did you review the technical documentation? A pause. I trusted Colin's assessment that the concerns were overly conservative. Despite the documentation from your senior deployment engineer explicitly outlining the risks. Stella's face was pale. I made a judgment call about risk tolerance and velocity. A judgment call, the gray-haired woman interrupted, that has now exposed us to potential litigation and has damaged client relationships that took years to build. Leonard, I want a full technical review. I want to know exactly what processes failed. Leonard nodded. Agreed. Anya, you'll lead the review. I want a complete postmortem by end of week, not just what happened, but what systemic issues allowed it to happen. Understood. Colin, you're suspended pending the review. Stella, he turned to her. We'll discuss your role separately. The meeting continued for another hour, diving into client retention strategies and legal exposure. I answered technical questions. Stella sat silent, her earlier confidence completely evaporated. When it ended, Leonard asked me to stay. Anya, he said once the room cleared, I want to understand something. You knew this deployment would fail. I knew it had a high probability of failure given the approach. But you didn't stop it. I wasn't in a position to stop it. I was removed from the deployment lead role and reassigned to an advisory position. Colin had authority. I provided documentation and raised concerns through appropriate channels. He studied me. You could have escalated to me directly. I could have. I made a judgment call that it would be perceived as political, a removed employee trying to undermine their replacement. So you let it fail. I met his eyes. I made sure I was available to fix it when it did. Which I was, and which I did. But no, I didn't throw myself on a grenade to protect a decision-making process that had explicitly excluded me as too conservative. He was quiet for a long moment. That's remarkably honest. You asked. I'm offering you a different role. VP of Engineering Operations, reporting directly to me. You'll have authority over all deployment processes, infrastructure reliability, and production operations. You'll also have veto power over any deployment you deem unsafe, regardless of pressure from product or executive leadership. Interested? I thought about 6 years of being overruled. 6 years of being the person who said no and being told I was too cautious. 6 years of preventing disasters nobody saw. What happens to Stella? That's being decided. Between you and me, her position is likely untenable. The board wants accountability. And Colin? He'll be offered a return to senior engineering once the review concludes. He made a significant mistake but under pressure from leadership. That's different from the leadership failure. I nodded slowly. I want the VP role in writing. With the veto authority explicitly stated. And I want a seat in product planning meetings, not to slow things down, but to integrate operational constraints early. Done. I'll have the offer letter today. That afternoon, I was back in the war room, this time by choice, coordinating the technical postmortem. Catherine joined me, along with two of our best infrastructure engineers. We rebuilt the timeline minute by minute. Every decision point, every warning sign, every moment where different choices could have led to different outcomes. At 6 p.m., Douglas Pemberton from Riverside Financial showed up for his meeting with our executive team. Leonard asked me to sit in. Douglas was professionally angry, the controlled fury of someone whose systems had failed, whose clients had complained, whose trust had been violated. 4.5 hours, he said. 4.5 hours where we couldn't process transactions. Do you know how many customer service calls we fielded? How many compliance reports we have to file? Leonard let him talk. When Douglas finished, Leonard turned to me. Anya, explain what happened and what we're doing to prevent recurrence. I walked Douglas through it. The decision to change deployment processes. The inadequate preparation. The warning signs that were ignored. And then the corrective actions, my new role, the deployment authority structure, the technical requirements that would gate any future zero downtime deployment attempts. Douglas listened. At the end, he turned to Leonard. I want quarterly reviews. I want Anya or her designated representative on the call. I want transparency into your deployment planning. Agreed, Leonard said. And I want financial consideration for the impact. Our legal team will work with yours on appropriate remediation. Douglas stood. Shook Leonard's hand. Shook mine. I've worked with you for 4 years, Anya. I trust you. I don't trust your company's judgment right now. Earn it back. We will, I said. After he left, Leonard exhaled. That went better than I expected. He's a reasonable person. He wanted accountability and a plan. We gave him both. How many more of those meetings do you think we'll have? All 4 clients who invoked review clauses. Probably with similar outcomes if we're consistent. Then let's be consistent. You'll join me for all of them. Over the next week, I led the technical post-mortem while simultaneously executing my new role. The post-mortem report ran to 60 pages. It didn't pull punches. It identified the decision points where different choices would have led to different outcomes. It documented the warnings that were provided. It named names, including my own. I'd made the choice not to escalate over Stella's head, and I owned that. But it also provided recommendations. New deployment authority structures. Technical requirements for different classes of deployments. Escalation procedures when operational and business priorities conflicted. Leonard presented it to the board. I wasn't in that meeting, but Catherine told me later that the gray-haired woman, who turned out to be the board chair, had called it the most thorough failure analysis she'd ever read. Stella resigned the following Monday. The official statement thanked her for her contributions and wished her well in future endeavors. The unofficial reality was that she'd been given the choice between resignation and termination. Colin returned to senior engineering 2 weeks later. To his credit, he sought me out on his first day back. Anya, I owe you an apology. I was arrogant. I ignored your documentation because I thought I knew better, and I didn't. Apology accepted. You made mistakes. The question is what you learned. That there's a difference between moving fast and moving recklessly. That the people who say no sometimes have really good reasons. Good. I'll need that energy on my team. We're going to move faster than before, but we're going to do it safely. That's harder than either moving slow or moving reckless. He nodded. I'd like to learn how. Then you'll work with Catherine on the next deployment. Observe, ask questions, understand why we do things the way we do. Then we'll talk about optimizations. My first month as VP was brutal. Rebuilding client trust, implementing new processes, hiring additional operations staff. But it was also clarifying. I had authority now. When I said a deployment wasn't ready, it didn't happen. When I said we needed infrastructure investment, the budget materialized. And we did move faster. Because when you build proper foundations, when you automate the safe parts and rigorously test the risky parts, you can actually deploy more frequently than when you're constantly firefighting disasters. 3 months after the incident, we completed our first successful zero downtime deployment. It took 6 weeks of infrastructure work to enable it, load balancer upgrades, database replication improvements, blue-green deployment automation. But when we executed it, during business hours, with clients' full knowledge and consent, not a single transaction failed. Douglas Pemberton from Riverside was on our quarterly review call the next day. "I saw you deployed yesterday," he said. "No impact on our end." "How'd you do it?" I walked him through the technical approach. He asked good questions. At the end, he said, "This is what I expected from Wildfire. Good work, Anya." That evening, I stayed late in the office, not because there was a crisis but because I was reviewing the next month's deployment schedule. The server room hummed its familiar baseline drone. Catherine stopped by my office. "Heading out?" "Soon. Just finishing the review." "You know, you could delegate more of this." "I could. But I like it. This is what I'm good at." She smiled. "The person who says no. The person who figures out how to say yes safely. There's a difference." She left. I pulled up my monitoring dashboards, the same ones I'd watched from my apartment that Friday afternoon, but now with official authority behind them. Green across the board. Systems humming. Deployments scheduled and prepared and ready. I thought about Stella's office with its glass walls and sunset glare. About Colin's competence and its collision with reality. About 40 pages of documentation and the phrase overly conservative. Funny thing about being conservative, you're only too conservative until something fails. After that, you're exactly as conservative as you should have been all along. My phone buzzed. "Leonard, board meeting tomorrow. They want to hear about Q2 deployment metrics and your zero downtime framework. Can you present?" I typed back, "Yes. I'll have slides ready." I started pulling together the presentation. Deployment frequency up 40% quarter over quarter. Incident rates down 75%. Client satisfaction scores recovering. Revenue retention at 98% despite the Friday disaster. The metrics told a story. Not about moving slow or moving fast, but about moving deliberately. About building systems that could handle speed without breaking. About the difference between velocity and recklessness. I saved the presentation and shut down my laptop. The office was empty now, just me and the hum of servers and the glow of monitoring dashboards showing stable systems processing millions of transactions. I'd spent 6 years being the person who prevented disasters nobody saw. Now I was the person who prevented disasters everyone understood the value of preventing. It turned out the job hadn't changed at all. Just who was listening.